Standing barefoot on the cold kitchen tiles, wrapped in a silk robe, Naomi Gregg watched the steam rise from both mugs like a question she'd stopped asking out loud. She'd memorized the sound of his footsteps by now, the precise weight of them, the way his presence changed the air pressure in a room before he even entered it. She heard him this morning too, and like every other morning for the past 7 years, her spine straightened on its own. Not out of fear. Something else. Something she refused to name. Alessandro walked in exactly the way he always did. Sharp suit already on, collar perfect, jaw set like he'd never once in his life been caught off guard. He moved through the kitchen the way powerful men move through spaces they own. Like the room had been arranged for his convenience and everything in it, including her, was simply part of the architecture. He glanced at the mug. Paused. Something flickered across his face. Something that wasn't quite nothing. Then he turned and walked out without a word. Naomi stood there for a long moment, both hands wrapped around her own mug, listening to the sound of the front door closing with quiet, controlled precision. Not a slam. Never a slam. Alessandro Agosti didn't lose control. Not over anything. Not over anyone. She took a slow sip of coffee. 7 years, and the man still wouldn't drink from a cup she'd poured for him. If you're new here and you love emotionally intense stories with real tension and real heat, subscribe right now and hit that notification bell, because this one is going to stay with you. She hadn't always understood what she was walking into. When Naomi Gregg was 26 years old, she was the sharpest financial strategist at her firm, brilliant, ambitious, and completely in control of every single variable in her life. She'd grown up learning that preparation was the only thing standing between you and chaos, and she had prepared for everything. Board presentations, market shifts, hostile negotiations. She had contingency plans for her contingency plans. She had not prepared for a man like Alessandro Agosti sitting across from her in a conference room at 10 in the morning, watching her with dark, unreadable eyes while she outlined a restructuring proposal that she had spent 3 weeks perfecting. He hadn't interrupted her once, hadn't questioned a single figure. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, and then he said with no particular expression, "You're extraordinary at this." She'd said thank you and meant it professionally. 3 months later, his lawyers called hers. The arrangement had been proposed with the kind of clean transactional language that Naomi understood perfectly. Strategic alliance. Mutually beneficial partnership. Public unity between their names, their brands, their social presence. Her firm's reach. His network's protection. Legally bound, publicly visible, privately separate. The terms were clear. No emotional obligations. No physical expectations. No complicated feelings to negotiate around. She'd read every line of that agreement twice. She was a financial strategist. She understood value exchange. And at 26, with ambition burning hotter than anything else inside her, she'd looked at the terms and thought, this is manageable. This is something I can control. She signed. She had been 26 and very, very smart, and also it turned out not nearly as prepared as she thought. Because nobody had told her what it would actually feel like to live inside a marriage that looked perfect from the outside and felt like a glass room from the inside. Beautiful. Structured. Completely airtight. And absolutely impossible to breathe in after a while. She ate alone most nights. Not because Alessandro was cruel about it. He wasn't cruel about anything, which was almost worse. He was simply absent. Present in the apartment but unreachable. She'd come home to find him in his office, door half open, and sometimes she'd walk past and he'd look up, and there would be this pause, 3 seconds maybe 4, where something happened in the air between them that she couldn't explain and refused to examine. Then he'd look back down at whatever was in front of him, and she'd keep walking. The apartment was beautiful. 12 floors up, floor-to-ceiling windows facing the city, every surface chosen with precision and taste. She'd redecorated her bedroom 18 months in, quietly, without asking for permission because she didn't need to. That was one of the few things the arrangement had been generous about. Her space was hers. His was his. The rest of the apartment was shared territory they navigated like two very polished strangers. Cicely thought the whole thing was unhinged. Cicely Okafor was Naomi's best friend since college, loud, brilliant, relentlessly funny, and constitutionally incapable of keeping her opinions to herself. She also had a very specific look she made whenever Naomi tried to explain her life calmly, which was a slow blink followed by an expression of profound disbelief. She was making that face right now across the brunch table. "So let me understand what you're telling me," Cicely said, setting down her mimosa like she needed both hands free for this conversation. "You have been living with this man Naomi, who looks like an Italian Renaissance painting that also runs a crime empire for 7 years. In the same apartment. And you are telling me that he has never. We have an arrangement." "I know about the arrangement. I'm asking about your situation as a human woman with eyes and a pulse." Cicely leaned forward. "Not once. Not even accidentally. Not even accidentally." Cicely stared at her for a long moment. "That is either the saddest thing I've ever heard or the most impressive display of self-control in recorded history, and I genuinely cannot decide which." Naomi laughed. It came out easier than she expected, and also a little bit sharper at the edges. "It's fine," she said. Cicely gave her the look again. "It's fine," Naomi repeated more firmly, because it was. Or it had been. Or at least it had been something she could manage, which was close enough to find that she'd stopped distinguishing between them somewhere around year 3. She was successful. She was respected. She had a career that she built entirely on her own terms, a life that was full and productive and genuinely good in most of the ways that mattered. She had worked very hard to make sure that the parts of her marriage that were empty didn't hollow out the parts of her life that weren't. For a long time it had worked. But there's a specific kind of exhaustion that builds up when you spend years performing contentment. When you get so good at being fine that you can't always remember what the alternative would feel like. Naomi had gotten very good at being fine. She just didn't know how much it had cost her until she stopped paying it. The shift was so gradual she almost didn't notice it happening. It started, if she was honest, with the night she came home from a work dinner laughing. Not performing laughter, not polite social laughter, actually laughing because one of her colleagues had said something genuinely hilarious, and she'd walked into the apartment still warm from it, still smiling, and she'd passed the hallway to Alessandro's office and she'd heard him pause whatever he was doing, and she'd kept walking, still smiling, and she'd thought, "I'm not going to stand outside that door waiting for him to look up. Not tonight." She'd gone to her room and fallen asleep actually at peace. And something about that quiet, small rebellion had loosened something in her. After that, she started eating dinner without waiting to see if he'd join her. She started filling her evenings with things that were hers, books, phone calls with Cicely, work she cared about, late nights at the kitchen table with a glass of wine and spreadsheets she found genuinely interesting. She stopped waiting. And apparently, though she hadn't intended this, hadn't planned it, hadn't calculated it, Alessandro noticed. She first caught him watching her 3 weeks after that. Not obviously. Not in a way that could be called watching if you confronted him about it. But she knew the difference between a man who is aware of you in the room and a man who is observing you, and Alessandro Agosti had shifted from the first category to the second. She saw it at a dinner party they attended for appearances. She was talking to a woman from a financial advisory board, genuinely engaged, laughing at something, and she glanced across the room instinctively and Alessandro was already looking at her. He didn't look away immediately. Neither did she. Then someone touched his arm and the moment broke. But something had been established between them in that 3-second exchange that Naomi couldn't quite name, and it sat in the back of her mind for days afterward like a song you can't stop hearing. Then there was Dino Caruso. Dino was a business associate, quiet, measured, the kind of man who listened more than he talked and made you feel, when he did talk to you, that you were the most interesting person in the room. He and Naomi had met through overlapping professional circles, and they'd had 3 or 4 very pleasant conversations at events over the past few months. He was warm and completely unthreatening, and he had, on one occasion, asked for her opinion on a financial matter and then actually done what she suggested. Which was refreshing. That was all. Alessandro apparently interpreted it differently. Naomi was at her desk at home on a Tuesday afternoon when Alessandro appeared in the doorway of her study, which was unusual. He rarely came to her side of the apartment without a specific, practical reason. She looked up from her laptop. He was leaning in the doorframe with the kind of studied casualness that she recognized, after 7 years, as Alessandro's version of performing relaxed. "You spoke with Dino Caruso again last night," he said. It wasn't a question. It also wasn't nothing. "I did," she said. He had questions about the Meridian portfolio. I answered them. He calls you often. We work in overlapping industries. Silence. Alessandro's jaw was doing something. The muscle at the side of it. She'd noticed that particular tell before, though it was rare. He talks to you for longer than the work requires, he said. Naomi put her pen down very slowly. Is there a question somewhere in this conversation? He looked at her for a moment. Then with incredible composure. I'm simply noting a pattern. You're noting, she said, that a colleague finds me competent and easy to talk to. That's one interpretation. What's yours? He didn't answer. He pushed off the doorframe and walked away, which was, she was almost certain, the first time in 7 years she had seen Alessandro Agosti retreat from anything. She stared at the empty doorway for a full 30 seconds. Then very carefully she picked her pen back up and pretended to go back to work, even though she couldn't remember a single thing she'd been doing before he walked in. Cicely's response when Naomi reported this exchange was a scream so loud she had to hold the phone away from her ear. He was jealous. He was noting a pattern. Naomi, baby, my love, he was jealous. That man was jealous. We're not, the arrangement. The arrangement, Cicely said, with the energy of someone who had been waiting to say something for a very long time, does not explain the jaw thing you just described to me. That's a jealous jaw, Naomi. I don't think jaws can be jealous. His can. Apparently. A pause. What did you do when he walked away? Naomi was quiet for a beat too long. Oh my God, Cicely said. You watched him leave. I was sitting at my desk. You watched him. She had watched him. She absolutely had watched him. The problem with spending 7 years convincing yourself you don't feel something is that the feeling doesn't actually go anywhere. It just waits. And it is surprisingly patient for something that runs this hot. Because she'd always known, if she was being completely uncomfortably honest with herself, that Alessandro Agosti was not easy to ignore. Not physically. Not in the way he moved or the way he spoke, or the way he occupied a space with such total, unself-conscious authority that every room he entered reorganized itself around him. Not in the way he occasionally, in unguarded moments, looked at things with a focus so complete it felt like being held. She'd spent 7 years not thinking about any of that. She was thinking about it now. There was an evening 2 weeks after the doorway incident when they ended up in the elevator together. It wasn't unusual, they lived in the same apartment, they attended the same events, but the timing was off in a way that left them standing side by side in a space that was suddenly inexplicably too small. She could feel him next to her without looking. The warmth of him. The quiet. The elevator was slow. She watched the numbers change and thought about literally anything else. The Caruso meeting, Alessandro said. How did it go? Productive. A pause. Good. Another pause. Longer. Naomi. She turned to look at him. He was already looking at her. Had been, she realized, for longer than the conversation required. His hand was near her waist. Not touching. Just near. Like it had moved toward her without his permission, and then thought better of it at the last possible second. The doors opened. They both stepped out like nothing had happened, like the air in that elevator hadn't just rearranged itself into something completely different from what it was 30 seconds ago. She didn't sleep well that night. She suspected he didn't either. After that, the moments started stacking. His hand near the back of her chair at a dinner they attended, not touching, hovering. His eyes finding hers across a crowded room faster than coincidence could explain. The morning he poured himself coffee and then very deliberately, stayed in the kitchen instead of leaving, standing at the counter while she sat at the table, neither of them talking, both of them aware. That was the morning she understood that something had already changed and neither of them had officially acknowledged it yet. She thought about the arrangement a lot during those weeks. The neat, clean terms of it. The agreement she'd signed at 26 with all her calculations in order and her ambition running the show. She didn't regret it. That was the honest truth, and she'd learned to be honest with herself about the parts of her life that were hard to look at directly. She didn't regret the choice. She regretted what she'd gradually, quietly, let herself become inside of it. She'd made herself small. Not dramatically. Not in a way anyone outside could see. But the version of Naomi that went to sleep each night in that beautiful apartment had been steadily shrinking for years, folding herself up to fit inside the terms of an agreement that had never accounted for the fact that she was a person with a full interior life and not just a strategic asset. She was done being small. The night she said it out loud, it wasn't a fight. There was no argument, no dramatic trigger. She'd come home from a long day and Alessandro was already there, in the living room, and she sat down across from him and looked at him for a moment. This man she had lived beside for 7 years without ever really touching, and she said, very quietly, "I don't regret marrying you." He looked up from whatever he was reading. His expression was still, but the quality of the stillness changed. "But I regret disappearing inside this marriage." She said it calmly. No tears, no performance. Just the truth finally out in the air between them. "I've been making myself invisible for years, waiting for something that the arrangement says isn't supposed to happen. And I'm not going to keep doing that." Silence. Alessandro was looking at her with an expression she couldn't fully read, something careful and complicated moving behind those dark eyes. "I'm not saying I'm leaving," she continued. "I'm saying I'm choosing myself. Whatever that means for us, I don't know. But I'm not disappearing anymore." She stood up and she walked to her room and she felt, for the first time in a long time, like she was standing fully inside her own life. She heard him, a few minutes later, get up from the couch. Heard his footsteps stop outside her door. He didn't knock. After a long moment, she heard him walk away. The next 3 days were different. Charged in a way she couldn't describe. Alessandro was still controlled, still composed, still moving through the apartment like a man who had never been anything but certain. But something had shifted in the way he tracked her. The way a room felt when she was in it with him. And on the 4th night, he cornered her. Not aggressively. Not in a way that felt like threat. But she'd been in the kitchen late, standing at the counter with a glass of water, and he'd come in and instead of doing what he always did, glancing, acknowledging, leaving, he stopped. He put his hands flat on the counter, a few feet away from her. And he looked at her the way she'd only seen him look at things that actually mattered to him. "I need to explain something to you," he said. She waited. He was quiet for a moment in the way of a man assembling words he doesn't usually use. Alessandro Agosti was not a man who explained himself. She'd understood that about him from the first conversation they'd ever had. He was precise and he was controlled and he did not offer access to his interior. But something had broken open. "In my world," he started and then stopped, jaw tight. Started again. "The things I was raised around, the people in them. I watched what happened to men who let themselves become." He searched for the word. "Legible. Who let people see what they cared about." His eyes met hers. "What you care about becomes what they use against you." The kitchen was very quiet. "So I learned to care about nothing they could touch," he said. "I built everything, this life, this position, on the principle that nothing gets close enough to threaten it." A pause. "And then there was you." Naomi didn't move. "I knew from the first month," Alessandro said, "that you were going to be a problem." Something shifted in his expression. "Not because you were difficult. Because you weren't. Because you were." Another pause. "That jaw. Because you were extraordinary and you were right there and I had a rule. I've always had a rule. And the rule exists for very specific reasons." "What's the rule?" she said softly. His eyes held hers. "Don't touch what you can't let go of." The silence between them was the loudest thing she'd ever heard. "The moment I touch you," he said, and his voice had dropped to something very low and very controlled, like a man holding something back with both hands, "I won't be able to pretend you don't matter." And there it was. 7 years. 2 mugs every morning. All that hovering and not touching and watching from doorways. All those elevator moments and lingering looks and retreating. Always retreating just before the line. Not because he didn't want her. Because he wanted her too much to survive it safely. Naomi set down her glass. "Alessandro," she said. Very quietly. Very clearly. He was watching her with something in his expression that looked on a man like him almost like pain. "You don't protect someone," she said, "by starving them." The silence that followed was thick and heavy and alive. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she'd never once seen him make before, and the sheer unguardedness of it made something inside her chest ache, And he looked away and back and away again, pacing 2 steps and stopping. I don't know how to do this halfway, he said. I know. You don't, he stopped. Looked at her. If I start, Naomi, I don't know how to stop. I know that too. He stared at her. And Naomi looked at this man, this controlled, complicated, impossible man who had spent 7 years protecting her from himself, and she understood with sudden and complete clarity that she had not been waiting out of habit. She had been waiting because part of her had always known that what was on the other side of his control was worth waiting for. That a man who wanted her badly enough to deliberately deny himself for 7 years was a man who, when he finally broke, would break completely. She stepped toward him. Not away. Not sideways. Toward. Then don't, she said. Alessandro Agosti stood very still. And then something in him, the thing he'd held locked and controlled and carefully managed for 7 years, stopped being managed. He crossed the space between them in 1 step, and his hands finally found her face. Not rushed. Not reckless. With the terrifying deliberate care of a man who had been waiting longer than he'd ever admit, who had memorized the idea of this so many times that the reality of it had to be handled with both hands. His thumbs traced her jaw. He looked at her for a moment, just a moment, like a man making a decision he already knew was irrevocable. And then he kissed her. Slow. Intentional. And so thoroughly earned that she felt it in the parts of herself she'd spent 7 years protecting. She kissed him back. And the kitchen, the apartment, the 7 years, all of it stayed exactly where it was, and all of it meant something completely different now. The weeks that followed were not a fairy tale. Naomi had been honest enough with herself for long enough that she wasn't interested in fairy tales. What they built in the weeks after that night was stranger and realer and significantly more interesting than a fairy tale. Alessandro did not become a different man. He was still precise, still controlled, still capable of clearing a room with a single look and negotiating in the kind of silence that made other men sweat. He still wore a suit at 7 in the morning. He still had meetings she wasn't supposed to know the details of. He still moved through the world with the kind of authority that came from being exactly the kind of man he was and having no intention of apologizing for it. But he started checking on her. Badly. In ways that were transparent to anyone paying attention and which he clearly believed were completely subtle. She'd be working at her desk and he'd appear in the doorway on some invented pretext. A question about a dinner reservation. An opinion on something that he absolutely did not need her opinion on, and he'd linger just a beat longer than the pretext required, looking at her with something that had no official name in the terms of their arrangement because the terms of their arrangement had never accounted for this. She started leaving the door open. He came to dinner now. Not every night. He was still fundamentally a man with a complicated life, but often enough that she stopped being surprised by it. He'd sit across from her and they'd talk. And it turned out that Alessandro Agosti, when he was not performing careful distance, was dry and sharp and occasionally very funny in a way that caught her completely off guard. You're funny, she told him one night, genuinely surprised. He looked mildly offended. I've always been funny. You have never once. I have been hilarious for years, he said with the same composure he used for everything, and you weren't in a position to appreciate it. She laughed. He watched her laugh with an expression she was starting to recognize, the one where he was letting himself have something he'd been refusing himself for a long time. He touched her differently now too. Not performatively. Not for the benefit of anyone watching. Small casual things that would have meant nothing in any other marriage and meant everything in theirs. His hand at the small of her back when they walked into rooms together. His fingers finding hers when they sat near each other. Not holding, just present. He'd pass her in the kitchen and his hand would brush her shoulder like it was the most natural thing in the world, like he hadn't spent 7 years preventing exactly this. She let herself have it. Let herself have him. Cicely, when she met them both for dinner 6 weeks after the kitchen night, spent most of the evening looking back and forth between them with the expression of a woman watching a documentary she had personally predicted. Afterward, when Naomi walked her out, Cicely grabbed both her hands and said, I have never in my life been so happy to be right. You're always right, according to you. I am. But this time, Cicely squeezed her hands, and the expression on her face was something softer than her usual mischief. This time I'm happy for you. Like genuinely actually happy. Naomi squeezed back. There was a night about a month in when Alessandro came home later than usual and she was still awake reading in bed, and he actually knocked on her open door. "I need to tell you something," he said. She looked up. He was standing in the doorway with his jacket off and his sleeves rolled up and an expression on his face that was, for Alessandro Agosti, remarkably unguarded. "I handled the situation with Moretti's people this week," he said, which was about as much detail as she ever got about that side of his life. There was a moment where he paused, jaw tight, where I was reminded very specifically why I maintained the distances I maintained. She waited. "Someone suggested," he said carefully, "that you were a leverage point." The air went cold. She kept her expression even. "I had that addressed," he said. His voice hadn't changed, but she knew him well enough now to hear what lived underneath the composure. "And I want you to understand that the way I protected you before, the distance, the arrangement, that was one kind of protection." He looked at her. "What I'm choosing now is a different kind. But I need you to understand that choosing it doesn't mean the world I operate in has changed." "I know what world you operate in," she said quietly. "I know you know." He looked at her for a moment. "I'm asking if you can live in it." She thought about the Naomi who had signed an arrangement at 26 and thought control was the same thing as safety. She thought about the years she'd spent making herself small because the alternative felt too complicated. She thought about who she was now, the version of herself she'd fought to get back, and whether that version could survive loving a man like this. And she thought about the kitchen, his hands on her face, the way 7 years of wanting had finally come out of him like something that had been held under pressure for so long it couldn't be anything but real. "I don't need a safe man," she said. "I need a real one." Alessandro looked at her for a long moment. Then he crossed the room and sat on the edge of her bed and kissed her forehead with the kind of tenderness that was so at odds with every surface he presented to the world that it made her throat tight. "Go to sleep," he said softly. "Are you staying?" A pause. "Yes," he said. Like it was simple. Like it had always been simple, and they just needed to find their way to it. She moved over. And Alessandro Agosti, Mafia King, the most controlled man she'd ever known, took off his shoes and sat against the headboard and opened her book to where she'd left off and started reading quietly, not to her. Just near her, just present, just there. And Naomi Gregg closed her eyes in an apartment that felt, for the first time in 7 years, like a place someone actually lived. In the morning there were still 2 mugs on the counter. But this time when Alessandro walked into the kitchen he picked his up. And drank it. He didn't make a thing of it. Didn't comment or signal. Just drank his coffee standing next to her at the counter, shoulder almost touching hers, watching the city wake up through the floor-to-ceiling windows. She looked at the empty mug when he set it down. 7 years. All of it, every quiet morning and every careful distance and every moment he'd pulled back just before the line. It had led here. To this. To a man who had loved her too dangerously to say so, finally letting himself have a life that was actually inhabited instead of just managed. And Naomi Gregg, who had spent years being extraordinary at everything except allowing herself to be seen, stood barefoot in her kitchen and felt, with complete and uncomplicated certainty, that she had chosen exactly right. Not because he was easy. He wasn't. Not because the world he came from was something she could pretend away. She couldn't. But because real had always been worth more to her than safe. Because she'd always known, somewhere underneath all her careful calculations, that the thing she actually wanted wasn't a perfect arrangement. It was this. Him. The coffee he finally drank. The door he finally opened. The 7 years that had made both of them into people who could finally actually hold this. If this story hit you somewhere real, and you know it did, drop a comment and tell me what moment got you. Was it the coffee? The elevator? Or the night he said he didn't know how to stop? And if you're watching this without being subscribed, fix that right now, because the next story coming is already waiting for you, and you do not want to miss it. Like this video, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching.